who would think that we would be here 50 years later? And with the excitement that I think will build even more, I'm so humbled and honored to talk to young nurses and their excitement. The same excitement that we had in the very beginning is inherent. I hope that our legacy will be that we are able to pass on this tremendous gift of our careers to new nurses.
You're listening to the ONS podcast, where ONS Voices Talk Cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between.
Hello, and welcome to the ONS podcast. I'm your host, Darcy Burbage, chair of the 50th Anniversary Committee. Today, I'm joined by founding Oncology Nursing Society members, Cindi Cantril, the first vice president, and Connie Henke Yarbro, the first treasurer. This episode is the first in a series celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Oncology Nursing Society. Throughout 2025, we'll feature an episode exploring ONS's rich history and promising future. For our inaugural anniversary episode, it's fitting that we talk to a few living legends who founded ONS and served as the first board of directors. Thank you for joining us today. Did you ever imagine we'd be celebrating 50 years of ONS?
No.
It's very exciting.
Yes, it is.
Hard to believe.
Oncology nurses have been practicing well before the Oncology Nursing Society was founded. I think members would be interested in knowing the work that went on behind the scenes to make ONS a reality. Connie, can you share a bit about how ONS started, such as, did you all know each other and come together to create the organization?
In 1973, there was really kind of the first nursing conference for oncology nurses in Chicago. At that conference, Lisa, Begg, Marino, and Shirlee, Koons, myself, and about 20 nurses met to discuss how we could identify each other and that we needed to communicate because we were really each isolated in our own separate cancer center or clinic. Virginia Barkley did find a room for us to meet, and we discussed that. We left Chicago. Shirlee Koons was going to put together a little nursing letter for nurses that we would identify. So the key was to start identifying nurses across the country to communicate with, which led to the 1974 conference sponsored by NCI. Cindi, I know that you were involved in that because we met again, and that was where we decided to let's explore what kind of organization we could have. Could it be independent? Would it be along with ASCO or ANA? And Cindi, I know you left there with the charge to look at independent organization.
I was always in my mind for our own independent organization. I think that ANA, we would have been considered a council, and ACS was going to probably create some sort of structure for us. But I really felt like the nursing needs were such that we needed to continue to identify others. And what's interesting is that I contacted a lawyer in St. Louis and told him what we were trying to do. And the comment was shocking at the time. And he said, well, you really could have your own autonomy. It would just cost $25 and you could start your own charter organization.
Wow.
Little did we know that we would grow to be where we are. I know that when you were talking about the first meetings, when we had our very, very first, what's now referred to as our Congress, but our very first meeting, we couldn't even get through the first paragraph of the bylaws. So word to the wise.
You mean the one in San Diego?
No, the one farther on down. So we ended up forming our own organization, a charter organization. Lisa at the time was in Chicago. Connie was in Birmingham. I was in St. Louis, and Daryl, our secretary, when we formed the board, was in New York City.
I remember that conference well in San Diego. Do you remember, Cindi? Were you there? You were there. You had to be.
Yeah.
Because Margot McCaffrey spoke on pain, and I don't know, there must have been about 20 or 30 nurses there. And we said, it was all agreed on that we needed to form an organization. And as Cindi said, independent. We were just selected. Cindi to be vice president. Lisa was going to go ahead and be president. I was treasurer and Daryl secretary. Left that meeting with the responsibilities of those offices and spent the year starting with the organization. And we were independent, and Lisa had the lawyer in Chicago draw up the bylaws and incorporate us. It was hard to believe.
I think what's really worth noting, Darcy, is that we all met as a result of the clinical cooperative groups. In other words, we also were attending ASCO because that was really our only national forum by which to keep up with what was happening in cancer care.
Yes.
Very few drugs existed at that time. So most of us were working in university settings where they were doing clinical research. And I think that's really important to note because just as an aside, what was really interesting is boxes of medication would come packed in dry ice, and there would be a lot number on a particular vial and no real explanations of what the side effects were going to be. The patients actually told us what the side effects are going to be. The reason I bring this up is I remember working with Suzanne Miller at Stanford. And what was really important is that those phone calls we had before email, those phone calls we had where I would say, do you know anything about the diluent for this particular, it was BCNU actually, which was pure alcohol. Do you know anything about the side effects? Or we were giving pretty much everything IV push and mixing ourselves and administering ourselves with butterfly needles. That's where it all began.
No masks, no gowns.
That's what I was going to say.
In a little room. Yes.
Did all of this before, as Cindi referred to, without electronic media. It was all the phones and also without all the protective equipment that we use now. So many surprises, so many challenges that you all overcame to put together this organization. What were some other things that were going on, like these first few meetings? What are some other things that you can share with us? I think this is so fascinating.
Well, I think what Connie and I have commented on is really, and I don't think they got until Dr. Hill and I did the podcast, I don't think the physicians that we were working with get necessarily enough credit in the sense that, for example, we were all working in university settings, and imagine trying to form an organization when we had 250 charter members, but imagine trying to communicate and imagine trying to get support. For example, I remember I was working at Washington University School of Medicine, the Department of Surgery, doing solid tumor work with the Central Oncology Group. And so often we were funded, the nurses, Connie, Daryl, myself, were funded to go to these ASCO meetings, and then we would meet as a nursing group, in conjunction. But I recall one specific time where we needed to get the bylaws copied into all of the participants that we had identified, all the people that identified as being, air quote, oncology nurses. And so I came in on a Saturday and we called it Xerox, literally hand Xeroxed all of these bylaws and mailed them out to people, which sounds like not a daunting job now, but it was then, because basically I had to stuff the envelopes, pay for them, take them, et cetera, et cetera. What was really interesting is then on Monday, Dr. Hill came in and he said, it seems like, because we had to account for everything in our department. And he said, seems like somebody was in on the weekend doing a lot of photocopying. And I said, really? That's interesting. And of course he knew, but he was being a silent supporter. And I think it's really important to talk about that. I know Connie was working with Dr. Durant, who was incredibly supportive.
Adding to that is that medical oncology and our specialty, we grew together. And I think that was so unique with oncology and the oncologists that we learned, we worked together. And I think that's why they supported us, as Cindi was saying. The administrative assistant at the Cancer Center UAB, she helped me learn how to set up the books and all the treasure. And then, like Cindi said, weekends, I was opening a bank account, writing the checks,
Wow.
cashing the checks, and then I'd write out a membership card and mail it to the new members. Everything was really done by hand in those days.
You were like the real you talk about, one thing at a time, just all the hand information. People take that for granted nowadays because it's so electronic, but you guys really did all of that work by yourselves to ensure that ONS continued to grow and build to the organization that it is today. You talked a little bit about cancer care at that time. Anything else you want to reflect on about healthcare in general, or other challenges perhaps that were happening in the world that may have impacted the early days of the organization?
I think that for myself, I was working, as was Daryl, working with literally surgeons. Surgeons in those days were doing the chemotherapy ordering and clinical trial work. Believe it or not, it's hard to imagine that there wasn't the tremendous knowledge and specialty of medical oncology in those days. And I think it's important to note that cancer was still not only a very feared disease, but at the time, I recall several patients saying to me that they were afraid that they were going to give cancer to their family members. In many cases, particularly in rural environments, patients thought cancer was contagious, which is hard to believe now.
Well, there's still some myths out there, Cindi, but, and I was with medical oncology, you were with surgeons, so we were really all defining our roles and also within the cooperative groups. But at that time, I was medical oncology, and I would travel the state of Alabama with a medicine to give Hodgkin's disease patients or children with leukemia their second dose. So they did not have to drive to the medical center because there weren't any oncologists in the community. They were just made at the academic centers. Today, I don't know whether you could get in a car and travel with your vincristine and procarbazine and all the other medicines.
Right.
So
I think too, what you touched on, not only, the myths, but also the stigma of a cancer diagnosis too. It sounds like, you faced that with the individuals that you cared for at the time as well. And that sometimes we're still dealing with that today with patient care as well.
I also think the partnerships that, for example, Ronaldo Hochemeier, who was the chief nursing officer at MD Anderson, worked very, very closely with the MD Anderson leaders. And those collaborations in those days, Susan Hubbard was working with Dr. DeVita at the NCI. Lisa was working with Dr. Altman and then moved to work with Dr. Fisher. Those collaborative relationships and mutual respect, I think, is really important. We could not have started ONS if we didn't have the support and the collegial respect that we had. I recall not ever wanting another nurse to hold a syringe and be actually afraid of not knowing what the side effects were going to be. Can you imagine not knowing all that you need to know about infusing a medication in a patient now? I guess it would be similar to phase 1 trials, but still, it was really, I think, the quest for knowledge from the nurses and the fierce desire to really make cancer care better in the psychosocial sense, in the safety sense.
And how to care for those side effects too, Cindi. I know we just didn't know what to do. Like you were saying, we called each other to say, how did you deal with this side effect from, with a certain agent? That was the only way we really learned how to manage some of the toxicities.
I just thank all of you for all that you've done to get things started for those conversations, because oncology nurses, that's one of our mainstays, is symptom management, side effect management, educating our patients. And as ONS, that's the home for oncology nurses to go to get those evidence-based resources to provide the education to our patients and to grow our own knowledge. You had mentioned Ronaldo Hochemeier, and I know when I was, preparing for this podcast, I read a little bit about, I think, Patricia Burns, and you had mentioned, I believe, Virginia Barclay as well. Then, Dr. Hill, Dr. Durant, and some of the other physicians, Dr. DeVita, so important that supported the development of ONS. Is there anything else you can share with us about those individuals that also helped support the organization and all of you in your early roles?
I can't remember, Connie, who it was, but remember we were called the young whippersnappers?
Oh, yeah.
You
We
know?
were the young radicals. we we were young and we started something that I think it was our timing. Timing was good. And like I said, Renilda and Virginia, they supported what was going on. And Catherine Nelson, in addition, too. Remember, she gave our first keynote in Toronto when our bylaws were rejected. That's what Cindi was going to talk about. Remember?
Oh.
We were so proud of those bylaws. Remember, Cindi? And then at the meeting, the members rejected them.
One other comment I wanted to make that I think was really serendipitous was really the uncanny, looking back retrospectively, they talk about hindsight. I want to call out the distinctive personalities and leadership skills that Lisa possessed, Connie possessed, I possessed, and Daryl. And it was a really incredible synergy and really foundation of trust. Lisa had inherent leadership capabilities. Connie, I'm going to tease her because talk about being a quintessential treasurer. I went to visit her in Alabama one time and I said, hey, I have to mail this to this member. And she said, well, do you have the stamp? Because we need to pay for this ourselves. I said, well, yes, I'll get the stamp. I just thought, and then Connie's vision of starting the foundation. So I think what is important is that we were, particularly to Connie's point, in the right place at the right time with profound, I'll say innocence, but passion about our specialty. And that we wanted our specialty to be the very best it could be. I remember how excited I was when we first developed the chemotherapy guidelines. I was just over the moon because we didn't have any guidelines prior to that. We didn't really know. And it was so interesting to look at researchers that came in to help us and really looking at the clinical expertise throughout the nation, which keep in mind, there was no Facebook, there was no social media, there was no LinkedIn, there was nothing in terms of identifying people. It was all pretty much word of mouth and just this huge excitement about our organization.
That's a very good point, Cindi. I mean, we were very innocent, but we were determined. And I think also pointing out, each of us really carried out specific roles. Lisa really did form a foundation by connecting with other organizations and trying to get the word out. And Cindi, I mean, you did a lot with the all conferences and the different committees, chapters, as we well know. and Daryl, I mean, with the newsletter that turned into being a journal. And I guess me being the tightwad, setting up money and goal of having enough money in savings each year in case something happened. So we were a team.
Yes, you all were. Both of you had mentioned about Daryl. Can you tell us a little bit more about her, Cindi, and her contributions to ONS?
So she was working with a doctor named Fred Gollum, and he really had a specialty in melanoma. She's actually taught me about interlesional BCG. At the time, melanoma, I think there was one drug we could use for melanoma. And predominantly, as with breast cancer and other types of surgical interventions, it was really quite extensive. When you go back, even looking at the Halsted mastectomy, you go back and looking at pelvic exonerations, you go back and you look at how far we've come from a surgical perspective. Keep in mind that we've learned that less surgery can often be more. Now they're even looking at, do we need to do even axillary node dissection? So I think the history and evolution of the foundation for what we were trying to do was really evidence-based. We were really trying to push the bar, always to make things better. Dr. Gollum had an appointment with New York University, and Daryl her personality was just perfect for her role. Very, very articulate, just perfect to be a great communicator in a very effective way and great writer, great editor. To think of literally a 6-page newsletter, now the Forum, or I guess it would be more appropriate to say the Voice, because it was really quite newsy, if you will. But an article on, for example, the first thing that was ever discussed in one of our early newsletters was intraperitoneal chemotherapy. No one knew what to do, particularly with that. But back to Daryl, I think each of us in our own ways served the organization and the development in looking back on it in perfect roles. I have a cute little quick story. Believe it or not, there was a meeting in St. Louis And I was just picking up people like, there wasn't Uber. So I knew somebody was coming in for a meeting. And this is really a cute story. You knew somebody was coming in for a meeting. I saw two doctors that I recognized of a major organization. And I said, are you going to the Chase Hotel to the cancer meetings? Yes. I said, well, I'm headed that way. Would you like a ride? Well, yeah. So they're sitting in the back of my car. This is true story. And they're strategizing about how they're going to deal with the ONS board, the new board. And they're talking about Lisa being a very strong leader, working with Dr. Fisher and having worked with Dr. Altman. And they were referring to the treasurer as being just this beautifully brown-eyed, wide-eyed, very, very polite Southern type woman. And then they said, well, we've heard the vice president kind of goes in and calms things down sometimes when things can get volatile. I didn't really consider myself in that way, but they certainly felt like I was. And we were facing some huge challenges from a couple of other organizations that I won't say. Anyway, I dropped them off. They checked in the next morning at 11 o'clock. We had the meeting with these physician leaders who I had already gotten the scoop from because I knew their whole strategy. It was one of my best moments in my career because I walked in and I thought, oh my gosh, the shock value on their faces was indescribable.
Priceless. Oh my gosh, I love it. That's a great story. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I want to switch gears just a bit and talk a little bit about the chapters. You mentioned them a bit, Connie, as they're such an integral part of ONS, especially for some of our members who live more in a rural setting or even the communities. Tell us a little bit, if you could, and Cindi, jump in too, how they came to be. Tell us a little bit more, if you could.
Well, I think it was looking back in 1976 when we set up some different committees, and one of them was local chapters. We were starting to realize that nurses in their communities or areas needed to keep in touch with each other. And the idea of a local chapter, Cindi can jump in because I know you were the board liaison to the chair of the chapter, local chapter committee. We had a lot of challenges. The procedures in that, they were not developed until the final thing, until 79. And the first two chapters that were chartered, being Chicago and Cleveland, were really our pilot chapters to work on the final guidelines and forms and everything. And I know, Cindi, you can pop in because I know you had some challenges during that time, being the liaison with the committee.
Well, I think also we were mindful that there were, we know inherently we're stronger together.
Mm-hmm.
Yet there were several members that didn't really feel we were meeting their needs. And we were kind of concerned about, frankly, splinter groups. I know that APON, the American Pediatric Oncology Nursing Society, I can't remember, Connie, if it was just in sync with us, or I think that was one of the things that we were a little concerned about, if the pediatric splintered off and other groups splintered off. And
they established themselves a year before us, though, Cindi,
yes.
in 74.
Yeah.
But I think I know what you're recalling is because there were some, not just the chapters, there were some groups of nurses that really did want to splinter off from ONS. They're kind of like, I don't know, I look back and I think, well, they were sorry that they did not think about starting such an organization. But we did deal with a couple of splinter groups. And I don't know, do we connect that to the chapters then? I can't recall.
Well, I just think it was one of the things we were mindful of. And I know that, full disclosure, I know right before a chapter meeting, I was asked to remove the head of that committee. And it wasn't called a committee. They were called, wasn't focus groups. It was charter. I can't remember the name of it. I'd have to look back up.
It was a local chapter. Local chapter is what we started.
There were some real challenges with it. And I understand. I mean, I just finished talking to the Big Sky chapter 2 days ago. And when you really look at statewide chapters, or you really look at individual chapters, they really are a product of their own environment, their own socioeconomic areas, their own challenges in terms of access, all sorts of things that we know that go into cancer care. And I think the proudest moment is that when we really started looking at the success and the excitement, I mean, think about Congress and you walk in and somebody says, hey, call out the Florida chapter, or, the individual where we are at Congress, and the energy and the pride and the enthusiasm of the Denver chapter or the St. Louis chapter is really, I think it's one of our best moments in terms of looking at how do we facilitate a large organization and allowing people to have some sort of more intimate autonomy in their own environment. Because let's face it, not every nurse is going to be able to go to Congress. Not every nurse is going to be able to go to a regional meeting. So the chapters really allowed for a wider net for us to identify nurses so invested in cancer nursing.
And look at the numbers that we have, starting off with just a few. It was just like a domino effect that they started really just, looking at their local area. And too, they each had a lot of support in those days too, from pharmaceutical industries. That was a different era at that time when they could provide a lot more support. But it's also created challenges.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think we need to really call out, while we were calling out the physicians, those pharma reps from Adria and different pharmaceutical companies were critical. They would actually provide the coffee or provide the meeting space for us to get together. We would not have been able to form ONS if it hadn't been the support. And it was really mutually beneficial. I remember, we didn't have the connectivity mechanisms that we have now. So I remember sometimes for me, the drug rep was really the most critical lifeline for me, knowing the latest data that their company was aware of a particular adverse reaction or a dosing difference or a mixing difference or whatever. And we had no other way of knowing. How is somebody going to talk to a nurse mixing chemotherapy, on a unit, have access to her? Unless we had the pharmaceutical reps being able to be an integral part of our conferences, they could attend tumor boards. And I think that if you go to the ONS office, obviously now you look at the inherent support we've had from pharmaceutical and equipment companies. Sorry, Connie.
No, I think that's very important because, our first research grant ONS had was because of a pharmaceutical company. You look at a lot of the fatigue, getting that off the ground, and the guidelines was supported by a pharmaceutical. And they did, as you said, provided the education we needed at that time.
It really took a village, didn't it, to get things started and continue to grow and thrive as we are today. As we're getting, believe it or not, nearing the end of our episode, I have a few more questions I'd like to ask the both of you. Reflecting on your oncology nursing career, what advice would you give to new oncology nurses? Connie, we'll start with you.
Well, I think it's a different era, but I would recommend that get out there. Don't be afraid to be a leader, to face some of the challenges. I think you're always going to have that nurse that's just very comfortable being at the bedside, and that's wonderful. And I think there are some nurses out there that really need the challenge and they want to be leaders and they want to learn and they want to grow. And I think really that's where the role of being a mentor and hoping that they will be a mentor and, a mentee is identifying them. I think that's important for leadership. I could probably go on, but I know, Cindi, you have some thoughts as well. Cindi's into the resilience, and she can really speak to the nurses today regarding that, how they need that support.
And Darcy, you know that I've been working very hard on resilience and was really honored to present by the board request on resilience at this year's Congress. I always start off when I'm talking about resilience is for nurses to really think about their calling, why they chose this incredible specialty. And I think oncology nurses in particular have the greatest gift. And that is we get to see our patients oftentimes for years and years and establish relationships with them and witness their journeys in a way that I don't know of very many other nursing specialties that are able to have those kinds of relationships with their patients. Oncology nurses need to know when to hold on and need to know when to let go. And most importantly, I think ONS has created a mechanism by which no nurse never needs to feel alone, like many of us in the very early days did. We have the connection of one another, of a huge organization that has a lot of influence. For example, at the very beginning of COVID in California, one of the nurses called me and said, we're running out of PPE because the chemotherapy guidelines at that point in time said you change between each drug. That wasn't going to work for somebody where most of our patients are on multi-drug therapy. And very quickly, I could call the ONS office. They got to who they needed to, and they were able to change those guidelines to a gown per patient, which literally saved so much PPE. And the point I'm trying to say to the young nurses is to embrace this calling and recognize that, for example, it sounds kind of flippant, but ONS has your back. We're going to make sure that we give you the latest research and that we're always there. We're like the mothership, if you will. And I think that that's really critically important for young nurses to recognize.
I love that. I think that's so important. And I'm just going back to what you both were saying earlier in the podcast, how you were called the young whippersnappers. And you got to be willing to take those risks too. So thank you for doing that. So I'm curious, with that being said, what are your hopes for the future of oncology nursing? What do you think the next 50 years holds for ONS and oncology nursing?
Who wants to go first?
You can go first, Connie.
Yeah.
You want me to go first because of age? Okay. 50 years. I mean, I look back at the last 50 years, it is just remarkable what oncology nurses have done in the last 50 years and the leadership. I think the future's a challenge with AI now. I just can't even imagine. You're reading studies now about virtual nursing care. I mean, it just is another world. But today I had a Zoom meeting with the foundation, Angie and Danielle, and I have to admit, I was amazed by what's happening with the History Center and the fact that oncology nurses are going to be able to do research through the mechanisms that are going to be offered, not just on nursing, but on care and other different methods for research. So, I mean, that really encouraged me to think that, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for oncology nurses in the future, opportunities that I really probably can't even imagine totally, but they're going to be there. And I think they will arise to the occasion.
Cindi, what do you think?
Exciting time. Who would think that we would be here 50 years later? And with the excitement that I think will build even more, I'm so humbled and honored to talk to young nurses and their excitement. The same excitement that we had in the very beginning is inherent. This last Congress was just amazing for me because I saw a lot of young nurses that were totally invested. You start at 6:30 in the morning and you go to very late at night, and they've got the stamina and they've got the passion. I hope that our legacy will be that we are able to pass on this tremendous gift of our careers to new nurses and to really elevate the perception of oncology nursing, continue to elevate that. And I think one thing I wanted to call out for Connie too is that her work with the international group and her being the president of the international group for a while, I think is critically important because, as I said, we're stronger together, but we have to face cancer as a worldwide health issue. And I just want to comment, not to get sidetracked, but comment that Connie really has had her feet on both sides of the ocean, so to speak. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
What a perfect way to end today's podcast. This has been a fantastic episode to kick off the 50th anniversary series. Thank you both for joining and sharing your stories about the beginning of ONS, your passion, your enthusiasm, it comes through. ONS has changed the lives and careers of many, many nurses, myself included. On behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you for all you did and do today, continue to do to promote the legacy of oncology nursing. And you're right, we are stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the ONS podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org and ons.org/voice. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.